On the edge of a large and foreboding forest lived a young girl who was sweet and kind, and everyone who met her liked her instantly. Wherever she went, she always wore a red hooded mantle, and for this reason, people called her Little Red Riding Hood. One morning, Little Red Riding Hood's mother asked her to take a basket of delicious food to her Granny Myra, who was sick in bed. Little Red Riding Hood loved her grandmother dearly and was pleased that she could do something for her. Now, Granny Myra's cottage was in the heart of the forest, and because it was quite a long way to walk, Little Red Riding Hood had to leave early enough so that she could be home before dark. So she wasted no time in putting on her red hooded mantle and quickly set off into the forest. On the way to her grandmother's cottage, Little Red Riding Hood often stopped and listened to the birds singing in the tree branches. She found the overgrown forest beautiful and enchanting. But little did Red Riding Hood know that she was being watched. Hiding behind a tree, a wolf was eyeing her every move. Now, this particular wolf was a sly and cunning creature who was always hungry and had a greedy appetite for human flesh. And on seeing Little Red Riding Hood wander through the forest, the wolf was rather pleased that a young child would be his next meal.
Yummy!
Slurped the wolf greedily.
Tender meat for my tummy.
Suddenly, the wolf jumped out from behind the tree and came face to face with Little Red Riding Hood. Now, Little Red Riding Hood did not know that this particular wolf was a sly and cunning creature. So she greeted the wolf with the same friendliness that she greeted everyone.
Good morning, Mr. Wolf,
said Little Red Riding Hood cheerfully. The wolf looked Little Red Riding Hood up and down.
Good morning,
said the wolf.
And where, may I ask, are you off to so early this morning,
Little Red Riding Hood thought the wolf kind for asking and replied,
I'm going to visit my grandmother. She's sick in bed, and I'm taking her some delicious food so that she can regain her strength and get well again.
The thought of food made the wolf very hungry indeed, and he rolled his sticky tongue across his lips.
And where does this granny of yours live?
asked the wolf. Little Red Riding Hood pointed in a certain direction and said,
Over there. You see where those tall oak trees are standing? Well, my grandmother's cottage is right behind them.
On hearing this, the wolf came up with a devious plan. For you see, although he wanted to eat Little Red Riding Hood just there and then, he realized that if he was cunning enough, he could eat both Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, and so doing, score 2 meals instead of just 1. With this thought in mind, the wolf asked,
Why don't you take your grandmother some pretty flowers,
Little Red Riding Hood's eyes lit up and exclaimed,
Oh, what a splendid idea! My grandmother so loves flowers, and the sight of them would certainly cheer her up.
The wolf smiled crookedly and said,
Then follow me.
and so Little Red Riding Hood, not knowing her life was in danger, followed the wolf deep into the forest. Finally, after walking quite a while, Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf came to a wide clearing where hundreds upon hundreds of beautiful flowers were in full bloom. Little Red Riding Hood was so taken with the magnificent spread of flowers that she failed to notice that the wolf had disappeared, and having not noticed it, she started to pick as many flowers as her arms would allow her to carry. Now, while Little Red Riding Hood was wandering from one flower to the next, the wolf was running as fast as he could to Granny Myra's cottage. Soon the wolf was standing at Granny Myra's front door and was loudly pounding on it for her to open. Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother was sitting in bed reading, and on hearing the ferocious knocking, she looked up and asked, "Who's there?" The wolf replied,
It's me, Grandma, your Little Red Riding Hood. I've brought you some lovely goodies to eat.
Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother smiled at the thought of seeing her beloved granddaughter and kindly said, "Come on in, my dear. The door's open. Just lift the hatch." The wolf pushed open the door and entered the cottage. There he saw Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother sitting in bed. She was wearing a pair of reading glasses, and on her lap she was holding a book. When poor Granny Myra saw the wolf, she got such a fright that she dropped her reading book and let out a huge cry. But her cries were all in vain. Without a moment's hesitation, the wolf grabbed her and swallowed her whole. Then the wolf did a strange thing. He put on Granny Myra's clothes, pulled her nightcap onto his head, and put on her reading glasses. Then he jumped into her bed, pulled the bed covers over him, and then he waited. In the meantime, Little Red Riding Hood was still picking flowers. Finally, her arms were too full to carry any more, so she made her way as fast as she could to her grandmother's cottage. When Little Red Riding Hood arrived at her grandmother's cottage, she was surprised to find the door ajar. Sensing something was wrong, she slowly and carefully entered the cottage. There she saw her grandmother lying in bed with what appeared to be the oddest of facial features, for she had a huge pair of eyes, a big, sharp set of ears, a long, protruding nose, and a rather wide, flat mouth. Little Red Riding Hood was astounded by what she saw, for she had never seen her grandmother look so strange.
Granny,
Little Red Riding Hood asked,
why are your ears so big?
The wolf replied,
All the better to hear you with, dearie.
Little Red Riding Hood's eyes widened, for she had never heard her grandmother speak in such a horrible voice. And for a reason unknown to her, Little Red Riding Hood was starting to feel quite nervous.
But Granny,
Little Red Riding Hood continued,
why on earth are your eyes so big?
The wolf replied,
All the better to see you with, my sweet one.
Little Red Riding Hood moved a little closer, almost looking up the wolf's hairy nostrils.
But Granny, pray, why is your mouth so big?
The wolf smacked his lips and opened his mouth as wide as he could and said,
All the better to eat you with.
And upon these words, the wolf jumped out of bed and swallowed poor Little Red Riding Hood up whole. Now the wolf's stomach had swelled up a great deal with the weight of 2 huge meals, and this made him very sleepy. So he lay down in the bed, and soon he was fast asleep. A few moments later, a hunter, who also lived in the forest, came walking past Granny Myra's cottage. Now the hunter was not in a good mood, for that same morning a wolf had eaten all his chickens, and the hunter was determined to find the culprit. When the hunter saw Granny Myra's door ajar, he was instantly suspicious and decided to go in and make sure that all was well with Granny Myra. He slowly entered the cottage and was horrified to see none other than a wolf napping in Granny Myra's bed. And what's more, this was the very same wolf who had eaten all the hunter's chickens. The hunter took his gun, pointed it at the wolf, and was just about to shoot him when it dawned on him that the wolf, being the sly and cunning creature that he was, might just have been brazen and wicked enough to eat up poor Granny Myra. So just to make sure, the hunter opened the wolf's mouth as wide as he could and looked down his long, dark throat. There, lying at the bottom of the wolf's stomach, were the bodies of 2 people, but who they were the hunter couldn't tell. So he quickly put his hand down the wolf's throat and pulled out none other than Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. Yes, they were alive, and when Granny Myra and Little Red Riding Hood saw each other, they were so overcome with joy that they embraced each other heartily. Now the wolf did not know that Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother had been rescued from his now empty stomach, for he was still fast asleep, and the hunter, realizing that the wolf could wake up at any moment, quickly went outside and fetched a heap of stones, which he threw down the wolf's throat, and in so doing filled up the wolf's stomach. And then he waited. When the wolf finally awoke, he got such a fright when he saw the hunter pointing his gun at him that he tried to run away. But the stones in his stomach were far too heavy, and the wolf simply fell down and died. The hunter gave himself a good pat on the back for having caught the wicked wolf, and without further ado, he threw his gun over his shoulder and briskly returned home. Alone at last, Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother sat down at the kitchen table and enjoyed eating the scrumptious food that Little Red Riding Hood had brought along in her basket. And after eating the meal, Little Red Riding Hood promised her grandmother to always be more careful when walking through the forest and seeing that the sun was soon to set, Little Red Riding Hood kissed her grandmother goodbye and quickly set off into the forest and safely headed